Hello and welcome to season 5.
Wait a second. I thought I was going to be doing the main emceeing this season.
Did you want to introduce us?
I would be doing the play-by-play.
All right.
And you took over.
I'm sorry.
And, all right. So, hello. Welcome to which season are we in? Season of Unlimited Opinion. What is it?
Season 5.
Six?
Season 5, episode 1.
Episode 1, and this season we are going to be following along with the book Tolkien Dogmatics by Dr. Austin Freeman.
Yes, that is correct. I'm Adam Bishop.
I am Mark Bishop.
And I figured we might want to start off just saying a few things about ourselves. This is a new season. You know, we might have some new listeners here. Who are you?
Who is this? Who are these new listeners?
Yes.
But go ahead.
I mean, it's possible. I'm Adam Bishop. I'm a college student. I've studied linguistics and classics at Truman State University. I'm a big fan of Tolkien. We've done 4 seasons so far on this podcast: philosophy, mythology, more mythology with Joseph Campbell, and then political theory. So we've had quite a bit of talking about all of these different things. A lot of humanities-related stuff. That's who I am, I guess, roughly. Who are you?
I'm your father.
Yes, you are. Yeah, I guess that's good to mention. Yeah, I am your son.
I am, that's my claim to fame on the podcast. Trained philosopher.
Yep.
Politician. Successful, then failed politician. In the local arena.
Yes.
Lawyer. I would say thespian, but I'm not an actor.
What? What does that mean?
Anyway, so I have a philosophy degree back in the ancient times, before the internet.
Yes,
mostly,
before the internet,
in the 1990s. And went on to law school. I'm a lawyer. Do a lot of local, small firm practice, represent a lot of local governments, which I tend to weave those kind of theories into, especially last season when it was political thought. But I have almost no interest in Tolkien.
That's good.
I have a passing interest in it. I like the movies. The Hobbit was better than
it wasn't.
Lord of the Rings.
It was not. It was much worse, actually.
But this book, I've only gotten through the prologue. I've not read the whole book because we're going to go chapter by chapter as we have with our previous seasons, using this as a jumping off point to talk about various issues that are raised in the book and go from there, right?
Yes, yeah, because we haven't really covered theology yet. We've covered, the history of Western philosophy, which there are, a bunch of Christian elements in it. But we haven't specifically focused on Catholic theology. Now, that's another important point to mention. We are both Roman Catholics, so we're looking at it as, this is our faith pretty much, and how Tolkien sort of interprets a lot of these elements of the Roman Catholic faith for the most part. And I guess it is also important to mention, as you cut me off in the beginning, for the past 4 seasons, I've been doing sort of the summarization of everything, taking notes, and then you were providing color commentary. But now we've flipped it, because I guess I'm more well versed on Tolkien, so I'll be providing the anecdotes and the supplementary stuff, I suppose.
Yeah, we're gonna try it.
We're gonna try it. We're gonna see how well it works.
You're struggling with taking the secondary role. Already.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm going to struggle with taking the primary role when I have to summarize these, and of course, your excellent summaries of the chapters of the previous books. They were great. Got a little long-winded in the last season.
Thank you.
And I was not completely to blame for our lengthy episodes.
That is true.
Last season.
That is true.
But mostly to blame.
Yes. All right. Well, do you want to take it away? Starting off with the Prolegomena?
Prolegomena. So I will make this initial comment that this guy, Austin Freeman, seems a little full of himself. Why would you not name the prologue the prologue? I had to look it up. I'm like, is there something different? We have a Prolegomena rather than a prologue? No, but you look up the definition. It says an introductory section of a book. See prologue. It's the same thing, isn't it?
I mean, it's Greek. I like it.
Oh.
I think it's fancy. It's probably a religious term too. That's probably why he includes it. It's probably a theological term. If you're introducing a theological text, it probably starts with Prolegomena.
I wonder if it's a reference to some Tolkien writings. Too,
probably.
Because he mentions that later in this. That's a little foreshadowing.
Yes,
later in
a little foreshadowing.
chapter that he he organized some things as a tribute or?
Yeah. Well, it is possible that Dr. Austin Freeman could listen to this, so don't be
dumping on him.
Yeah, dumping on him too much. Well, he was just on the Babylon Bee podcast. That was we noticed right after we bought the book, and like that kind of sold us on it. The Babylon Bee, of course, a great sort of conservative satire site. He was talking about if Middle Earth was queer. I watched the whole interview. Very good interview.
I didn't even know that was a topic. Middle Earth.
That's the title of the YouTube videos. Is Middle Earth is not queer.
Oh, okay.
Of course, they talked about a lot of other things about how Tolkien and academia are sort of applied. I really like Dr. Austin Freeman from what I've seen so far. Of course, I haven't read the whole book. I read one of his articles. He's written. Probably should have introduced him a little bit. He's a lecturer, I believe, at Houston Baptist University. And has written a lot on Tolkien, so is pretty much an expert, I think, in the field.
You know, when I was growing up, I don't know. I don't think it's the same as it was then, but you know, the Baptists did not like Catholics. When I was growing up, there were Baptists that thought we were really kind of Satan worshipers because of the infallibility of the Pope and the worshiping of Mary and the idolatry. I'm using their perspective. Yeah. And so there were people kids that would say stuff to me that their parents told them about Catholics. You know, so but I don't think it's like that anymore. But I don't know
because maybe not.
Maybe they're just quieter about it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if he's Baptist himself. And I think Houston Baptist University just changed their name to Houston Christian University. Like, since this book was published, on the back of the book, I think it's listed as Houston Baptist. But I looked it up, and I think they said, we are now Houston Christian University.
So I wonder if they're Baptist like Notre Dame is Catholic, which is not at all.
I guess it's possible.
Hostile to the Catholic religion. Yeah. Oh, Notre Dame, the great Irish. Anywho. But yeah, in my normal rule of thumb is I don't want to read any book that's been published after the year 2000 if it has anything to do with the humanities, and even then, because I don't want some hippies from the 60s. But you know, the funny thing is the hippies from the 60s had better academic credentials and are better writers than the modern day people generally, but so far so good.
Well, we were mentioning that when we were looking up this book. It's like it's kind of sad that we have to do so much research on just the author of a book to see if it's going to be, you know, complete and total crap. Like,
no, I mean, if it's a modern writer, it's usually inaccurate.
Yeah, and this was just published back in November of 22. So this is a very recent book.
Me, a lot of heartburn.
Yeah, but through the introduction, I've liked it so far. But let's actually start summarizing.
The Prolegomena.
The Prolegomena, exactly.
Prolegomena.
Yeah, yes.
All right, so the prologue. Shall I take over?
Yes, please do.
The play-by-play. So starting, basically the prologue is an explanation of what this book is and what it is not. You're looking at me. Are you
I'm attentively listening. I'm eager.
This is the first time in years that you've listened to me.
Yeah, it's not like we have 100+ episodes of me listening to you rant about everything.
I meant more as a father.
What?
So I mean, the author phrases it as an examination that he mentions very earlier on that. But Tolkien, as every individual does, had a theology. And that's an important thing for our listeners to realize, is that everybody has a theology, whether they're religious or not. But that's more of a commentary on it. And so the author's letting us know that what he's doing is trying to figure out how Tolkien's personal theology played into his writings and into the Lord of the Rings and the various literature that Tolkien drafted, including and using as letters as some authoritative texts. It's an interesting study where he's talking about a couple of the he mentions the two most significant theological writings of Tolkien is a letter to C.S. Lewis sharply criticizing him on divorce and marital ethics, and then a lengthy apologia to the Catholic bookshop owner who calls him out on theological impropriety. But those are never sent, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah. I have so many Tolkien books. I've read the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is a collection of, letters by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's really interesting stuff. That's probably the most explicitly, here's what I think about the real world and some little snippets of politics and stuff like that. So it makes sense that that's what he's drawing on here. I think he also mentions the history of Middle Earth, And here, the 12-book series, I've read all of those, which are like the writings of the writings, if that makes sense. So past drafts of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and then like supplementary stuff that's never been published except there, like in an official like secondary book. And that's where you get a lot of his like, okay, here's how like the metaphysics of the elves and how they actually operate and things like that. And here's how the gods interact with the humans and stuff like that. And so it's like really a lot of the theological stuff, and I think he gets into that a little bit, is not explicit in the Lord of the Rings at all. What he does comment on theology and sort of the more philosophical stuff is in his writings to himself or unfinished drafts or letters and things like that, which is an important thing to consider.
My question I have is, do you think Tolkien didn't send those letters because he decided he was mistaken? Or do you think they were too accurate and too full of truth?
I mean,
or why do you think he didn't send them? Because it's always interested me in these correspondence back when people wrote letters. Well, even now, like if you send an email, a lot of people have the 24-hour rule. Don't send an email when you're angry. You got to wait 24 hours. So the question I have is, when you think about these people that wrote letters, like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, or John Adams to his wife, and back and forth. Well, the recipient had to save them so that we would ever see them and put them in a box or something. So these are saved because he wrote them, but didn't send them and didn't destroy them. So it must have been in his papers, right? Yeah. So does that give it? Is that mean to you as an expert on Tolkien, such as
I would
you
not
are?
Consider myself that. For sure.
Would you? You're more of an expert than I am. Would you consider them to be a more accurate statement of his beliefs, or less accurate because he didn't bother to send them?
I mean, I think if he realized it was wrong, he would have destroyed them. But then there's also the question, because he kept basically every draft of, that's why we have a 12-volume series of the history of Middle Earth with all of these drafts. So he kept things even after he was like, well, they're wrong. They don't fit this imaginary Middle Earth worldview anymore. They don't fit in my like metaphysics and stuff.
Well, if he keeps those wrong things, how do you?
That's what I was thinking.
Oh, okay.
But he keeps them because they're still important, right? And I think it's different, opposed to theology versus like the metaphysics of Middle Earth and the workings of Middle Earth, because of course, the metaphysics or the reality of Middle Earth changed over time as he was writing. I don't think Tolkien's theology really changed, right? When he wrote that letter to C.S. Lewis and never sent it, I don't think it was because his beliefs changed. It's just maybe it was too aggressive. Maybe it was too, I don't need to say this to my friend right now. Yeah. I could just talk to him about this in person, make it more clear, things like that. I don't think it was necessarily unsent because it was untrue. I think because Tolkien was a very ardent, religious person and stuff. So if he really believed that it was false and shouldn't be sent because it was false, I think he would have destroyed it.
Well, that's a good point.
Thank you.
We'll go to, obviously the author believes that they are an accurate statement of his thoughts and his theology, and that's why he's using them as really authoritative text of the theology or theological beliefs of Tolkien. So then the author goes on to describe the things that are most significant to Tolkien to understand him. I think this is according to Tolkien, that his birth, when he was born, it was in 1892, his experience of a pre-industrial age, and more importantly, his Christianity, are like the three things that you'd have to know about him, or that really influenced his writings and his beliefs. And how do you think that his experience, or do you think his experience in the pre-industrial age affected Tolkien's writings and beliefs?
So I do think so, and I think it's like very clear, especially when you're looking at like the Hobbits and the Shire. Like I think the Shire's like the idyllic pre-industrial, English countryside, and I think he even talks about it sort of in that frame of mind in some of his letters, and that it's free from the worries of this sort of stuff, and sort of returning to this non-industrial age, I think is important for Tolkien in a way. That the best place to be is far away from the smoke and the clouds and everything of the big city. I do think it is an important part of his writing.
And do you think he like the orcs and it's been a long time since I read Tolkien. In fact, it was probably when I read it to you as a little kid. But like in the movie, it's almost like the orcs and the bad guys are almost more industrial, even though they're both making swords. I guess one just has better air quality or something. I don't know. Because like they're making the same armaments, but some are shiny and silver, and the other ones are like dark. Mm-hmm. You notice that?
Yes.
So do you think
what's your question?
Do you think it's a commentary on the evils of industrialization?
I don't know if it's, because this is a big thing, and I think he talks about it a little bit. I don't think it's an analogy, right? Because Tolkien was very opposed to analogy. He mentions this, Saruman is not Hitler. Saruman is not arming the Nazis. That's not what's going on. This isn't an analogy for World War I or World War II or whatever. I do think the theme of, nature is very important in sort of, the overuse of nature, I think, is really what he's talking about here. He's not saying, because like you said, you point out both sides have swords. He's not saying never make swords.
Well, I think the author seems to agree with you, because he talks about Tolkien's writing is not like a theology, but it's a way to express religious themes and moral questions through the medium of storytelling. So that maybe it's like influenced by these moral themes, but it's not a direct commentary where this character is this role in reality, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, exactly.
I think the author, Mr. Austin Freeman.
Dr. Austin Freeman.
Mr. Doctor.
Mr. Doctor. Mr. Austin Freeman, yes.
Do you call people doctor when they aren't medical doctors? I think I'm refusing to do that at this point.
Really? I mean, I do to my professors, because...
Oh, God.
That's
really?
I mean, yeah.
Did I?
Some of them get angry. Some professors get angry if you don't call them doctor. I worked hard for this degree, blah, 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 blah. You're going to call me by my proper title. Some of them do get angry.
Really?
Yeah.
I would call them
usually
Steve.
the worst professors are the ones who get angry about it.
The truth.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, because a medical doctor, like I know some doctors personally. Of course, I know them socially. So, sometimes I'll call them doc or doctor. But, of course, I know them. I guess it's not really a good analogy, because I know them. I can call them their first
I mean,
name.
I think it's, a term of respect, because I do recognize it's a lot of work to get a doctorate, really, in pretty much any field.
It's a lot of time.
It's a lot of time, yeah.
It's a lot of time. I don't know how much work it is.
That's a fair point. But, I will call my professors doctor if they request it. Some don't at all. It's like, call me Doug, right? And
I don't like that either.
Yeah.
It should be Mr. Doug.
Mr. Doug. All right.
All right. So moving on, the author also talks about how there's no really overt religion, and that Tolkien has said that he has not put it in any sort of religious, overtly religious themes in it, or religious practices, I should say, and they've eliminated almost all references to anything like religion or cults or practices in this imaginary world. Like in Middle Earth, you don't see any religious practices or ceremonies. The only ones, I mean, what would you're kind of giving me this?
There's one good example, and I think Tolkien might have even changed this in his later writings, but it was published in the Silmarillion, which was published after his death. But in Numenor, the island of the men who are blessed by the gods and things like that to have longer lives.
Is that the sailboat people that they're in that newest version of the terrible
Rings of Power, the horrible, forsaken Amazon series. Yeah, Rings of Power, they're the ones who are out in the island and sailed over to Middle Earth. But they do have a religious ritual at the peak of the highest mountain, and they praise Eru Ilúvatar, the highest god, essentially, the analogous to the Christian God in a way. Not an analogy, of course, but he is the highest god, and they have
that in
the Lord of the
Rings,
or
in the Hobbit.
No, but I think really the point that Tolkien is making there is eventually that ceremony is replaced. It's a very sort of reverent ceremony, and they go up, and he kind of describes the procession in a decent ways, but that's replaced when Sauron comes over to Numenor, and he pretends to be a good guy and whatever, and really Eru Ilúvatar is working against you, Numenorians. That's what he's saying, and that's when you get the most explicit sort of church-like religious setting, and that he actually builds a temple to Morgoth, Melkor, like the biggest bad guy above Sauron in Middle Earth, or in the in the Legendarium. And that's the most explicit religious ritual, and that's described as awful. Like the worst thing to ever happen to Numenor is this very explicit religious ritual where you have sort of a church-like setting.
And that's interesting because the author continues and talks about how Tolkien's writings were meant to display a truth or the truth and encourage good morals in the real world, but while telling a fake story, a story of fiction, a story of these things. But his idea was, I'm going to create this story so that to inform people and display truth and recognize good morals. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yes.
All right. I was going to make a Star Wars reference, but I'm trying to not be on the color commentary.
You can make a Star Wars
reference.
Onto
the next section. The monstrants and their critics. So it's another term. Yeah. And I was trying to wonder if he was actually referring to...
The Monsters and the Critics is an essay by Tolkien.
The Monsters and the Critics?
The Monsters and the Critics, yes.
Well, this is monstrance, which is completely different than a monster.
Yes, it's a play on words.
A monstrance
A pun, if you will.
A pun?
Yeah, if you change a word, it sounds like a word. You're making a little play on words. It's a pun.
You think this is a pun?
I think it's a pun. I think it's a type of pun.
But a monstrance is like the really decorative thing you put the Eucharist in, isn't it?
Yes, during adoration, Christian or Catholic adoration. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Catholics believe that the body and blood truly become, or the bread and wine truly become like Jesus' body and blood, and then adoration is sort of a veneration of the body as Jesus himself, and a monstrance, a very decorated, usually golden thing that displays the Eucharist.
Yeah, so it's like a big giant. I don't know what it looks like, but it's like, well, usually it's kind of somewhat in a crucifix form, but it has a lot of gold and jewels and stuff, and in the center usually has like a
little glass thing where the Eucharist
with
is.
a little door that opens up, and you put the Eucharist in.
Yes.
Then you close the little door, the latch.
Yes.
And then you hold this big thing up, and it's a lot of times it's like 50 pounds of gold.
Yes.
Which is, I think, what Jesus would want you to do. But that's a different subject altogether. All right, so then the author talks about how he's going to go that this introduction, which he calls a
Prolegomena.
He doesn't call it a prologue. I don't know why he doesn't call it a prologue. It's a prologue. It's Prolegomena.
I'll look this up while you're talking.
He's saying this introduction. So is the Prolegomena an introduction or a prologue? But there is no introduction. There is no prologue. There is a Prolegomena. Anyway, he tells us he's going to divide the introduction into three parts. First, he's going to engage several objections to the propriety of the project. So first, he's going to explain why he should not have done it. Then he will explicitly lay out what he does and does not want to accomplish with the book. And then he will outline the methodology that he has employed in reconstructing Tolkien's theology. A lot of this, I think, is guesswork, isn't it?
I think to an extent. To answer your question,
mind read Tolkien's theology. So yes,
because you're very hung up on the Prolegomena.
Yes.
In the study of systematic theology, Prolegomena refers to the study of preliminary matters that are necessary to set up the formal theological study. These issues might include how the theological study will be conducted, how we acquire knowledge and arrive at truth, the theological system or tradition that will govern the study, and the sources that would be considered authoritative. So it's a theological introduction.
So that's the proper term,
yes,
because this is a book of theology.
Yes.
But it's one dude's theology. Or it's really one dude writing about another dude's presumed theology.
Yes.
Anyway. He says he's borrowed a lot, or he calls played upon Tolkien. He's going to, in this book, played upon Tolkien's well-known work Beowulf, a translation and commentary, entitling this section. So I assume that's what he's talking about: the monstrance and the critics.
Yes, the monsters and the critics. Yes.
Monsters and the critics. So that was the pun.
That's the pun. Yes.
I should have laughed.
You should. I laughed.
So have you read his translation of Beowulf?
I have. It's very good. I've also read his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Pearl. Orfeo.
What's Pearl?
That was a Middle English poem written about the same time as Sir Gawain. Very sad, because it's from the perspective of a father, presumably, who's lost his young daughter, and he calls her like his Pearl. And it's a very sad poem, but it's neat.
I liked the book The Black Pearl.
Thank you for that. Good commentary.
All right, so how am I going to continue this? I'm not very good at this summarizing.
You're doing fine.
Am I doing well?
You're doing well.
I'll get better as we go along.
Yes, probably.
So a lot of this prologue, he goes on to kind of discussing, different schools of thought on how to even evaluate Tolkien's writings and his theology, and there's a critical school of thought who want to downplay the religious side of Tolkien when you're looking at his writing. Basically, you're just looking at his writing absent the theological underpinnings, whatever his personal religion is, and just look at it as a work of art, so to speak, which I think it seems to have a certain merit.
Sure.
And basically looking at it as Tolkien trying to recapture these pagan myths and have just a kind of a new fiction book and not really get, I don't know, you say bogged down with the theological side of it, the religious side of it. I don't think that's what our author is going to do.
No, probably. Well, considering we're looking at the theology of Middle Earth.
I think he is explicitly refuting, or not refuting, he's specifically not following that critical theory, but he's mentioning that. And because he's saying, let's see.
Well, he talks about, how you miss out on a lot of it. To say that there's no Christian elements, to ignore all the Christian elements, you miss out on so much of the meaning. I think,
he says it's like an oversimplification of the writing. Well,
he also says the other side too. He's like, if you're just focusing on it, saying it's purely Christian, there's nothing pagan, there's no, any of this mythology element, it's just a Christian work, then you're also oversimplifying. You can't use both of those approaches. Both of those approaches are wrong. You have to find somewhat of a middle ground.
Yes. And so I'm struggling with this summary.
You are.
This is a lot harder to do than I gave you credit for.
Yeah. Only 100 episodes of doing it under my belt or so.
I don't think I can do 100 episodes of this because it's hard for me to summarize what he's saying without putting my 2 cents in every other word.
I figured you would struggle with that.
I don't like sharing other people's thoughts. All right, so his plan is to first, most extensively look at the debate over whether Middle Earth is a Christian realm. Second, he was going to caution against drawing too direct a link between the theology of Middle Earth and the theology of Tolkien himself. I'm on the bottom of page 4.
Yes, I see that.
Third, he's going to ask whether Tolkien's constantly changing views exclude a single cohesive theological picture. And finally, he's going to relate theology of Tolkien to the theology of Roman Catholicism, which would be interesting because this guy's not a Catholic, which he mentions to us later in this Prolegomena.
Yes, exactly.
And so he asked the question for the next section: can we have a Christian Tolkien? He's obviously Christian. He was a devout Catholic, and I think deeply religious, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And that's pretty well known and established, right?
Yes.
Was he anything other than Catholic? I don't know his personal history. Sometimes people get converted.
That is an interesting question because I forget off the top. He was raised by a priest. I know that. His mother died, I think, of diabetes when he was really young, and his father had died a few years before that. So he and his little brother were raised, I think, by a Catholic priest. But he might have been baptized Anglican. And I forget the details there, but I know that he was very in line with the Roman Catholic Church later in his life.
Well, the Anglican Church was very closely aligned with the Catholic Church way back when because they were just a splinter group because of the split between the king and the religious authority and all that stuff. All right, so the emphasis in this book, according to the author, is on Tolkien as a theologian, not on Middle Earth as a theological writing, right? So it seems like he's telling us in this prologue, he's going to be talking about Tolkien's theology, not necessarily the book's theology, right? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
All right.
Because the theology of the book itself, that'd be more like, in the world of Middle Earth, you do have the gods, and he describes those, in the Silmarillion, the Valar and the Maiar, and of course, Eru-Ilúvatar and stuff. So that would be like the theology of Middle Earth. And of course, Tolkien did not believe in the Valar and the Maiar and Eru-Ilúvatar. He did not believe that they were real. He was telling a story about them. So to separate, that the hobbits would not pray if they did pray at all, in the same way that Christians pray, and that sort of thing.
Right. But that's not what we're doing.
That's not what we're doing.
We're talking about
Tolkien's view and how it's reflected in
and
Middle
how
Earth.
he has used that to inspire him in writing this.
Yes, exactly.
And maybe have influenced his writings. And there's a long discussion next about, the different ways that different people have written books about Tolkien. I don't know that we need to go through all that, or maybe if you want to, because it seems to be, there's a discussion of how many authors have studied the theology or philosophy of Middle Earth versus, what we're going to be doing in this book. And it seems like, I don't know, maybe you know this, that there really hasn't been a whole lot of an evaluation of Tolkien's theology as an individual, right?
It depends on how you describe theology. There's all kinds of books and writings about sort of the philosophy of Middle Earth and things like that. And
but
sort
that's
of
not what we're doing here.
Yeah, that's not what we're focusing explicitly on theology. And in the Babylon Bee interview, the podcast that I saw with him, and he does bring up sort of the various like sects of Tolkien scholars, because the hosts of Babylon Bee were like, well, did you see that? I think it was last year. The Tolkien Society, they have some sort of conference on, academic writings on Tolkien.
Oh, really?
All of them within the Tolkien Society were, the underlying homoerotic themes in Middle Earth, and how I think there's one about transgenderism and how it's reflected in Middle Earth. And so he's like, yeah, that's how the whole Tolkien Society is. Everybody there is sort of that. And he says, well, that's a bigger issue with academia overall, because that's how you make a name for yourself. You have to introduce the modern day stuff into older things. But he says, so that's just one group of authors. Tolkien Society is definitely one group of authors. All of Tolkien scholars are not looking for transgenderism in Frodo Baggins, right? He says, there's definitely good Tolkien scholars out there who are not just looking at, let's find something gay in the Lord of the Rings.
And I've marveled at how people sexualize historical figures to such a degree. And that's been going on for decades, like the Log Cabin Republicans, which is a group of Republicans that are homosexuals, I guess. I don't know do you have to be a homosexual to be a Log Cabin? I don't know. Maybe I have to check their bylaws. But it's obviously a homosexual advocacy group within the Republican Party, because I think they believe that Lincoln was somewhat of a closeted homosexual or something like that. That's why they call it Log Cabin. I think it's Lincoln, but anyway. And of course, there's all the theories about Jesus and his apostles and stuff. And it's like anytime there's a historical figure that has a close male friend, a male character, close male friend, they just want to degenerate that into some sort of homosexual group or coupling or whatever. I just find that really weird. And it really is that whole homosexualization of all male bonding is just really, really a foreign concept.
Well, that's what Austin Freeman mentioned on the Babylon Bee podcast. It was right at the end of the podcast, and they had like some more that was locked behind. You have to subscribe to our Babylon Bee, whatever. Yes, it was unfortunate. So I didn't see the full interview. But right at the end, they asked the titular question. Well, are Sam and Frodo gay? And Austin Freeman goes, no, that's all I need to say on that. Just no. But then they're like, oh, well, we have some quotes. We have some arguments that people have made. Right. And one of them's like, I don't know. And, Sam held Frodo in his arms and like kissed him on the forehead, or Frodo kissed Sam on the forehead. And he's like, oh, yeah, because there's only one type of love. Right. There's only one type of love. Right. Everybody knows this. If you say that you love somebody, then, it's purely romantic love. It's
correct.
Ridiculous.
Yes. Yeah, it's a weird thing.
Yes.
All right. So moving along, I'm kind of skipping over those discussions, but I do want to mention that the author makes clear that the Middle Earth, creation has a natural theology that is determined by the truths of grace, according to him, and is based upon somewhat on the philosophy of Thomas, or the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
How so? How is it based upon some of the theological ideas of Thomas Aquinas, if you could articulate it now while putting you on the spot?
I mean, I haven't read nearly enough Thomas Aquinas to really describe in detail, but I mean, Thomas Aquinas underpins basically all Christian theology, since he wrote. He became the official, Catholic, philosophy, essentially. But just generally, the principle...
Isn't his thought that all humans have basically you only get salvation through some sort of grace, right?
Yes.
Right?
I believe so.
And is how is that theory of grace or spiritualism in some manner exhibited in the Middle Earth stuff? Is it like the gifts from the elves? Is it
that's an interesting question. I don't know if it's specifically sort of the grace idea that's really what's being focused on. Maybe the idea of sort of like God's plan. I think that was also, I could be wrong, but I think that is a Thomist idea of, that God did have a plan, and he articulated, prime mover and stuff like that, the five proofs and everything like that. And that was definitely, that is the creation story. Is Eru Ilúvatar, he makes the Valar and the Maiar sort of the angels, so to speak, if you want to equate them that way. And then the creation happens through a song. And he's sort of the chorus leader, and they all sing the universe into existence. And the reason that evil exists is because Melkor Morgoth, later called Morgoth,
off key or something.
He introduced discord. That's exactly what it is. He was essentially off key. He was purposefully fighting against the plan. And there's like three phases to the music. At first, everybody's in tune. Then Melkor introduces discord, and then at the end, he will bring them back into harmony, essentially sort of a prophecy of, there will be harmony again and everything will be back within God's plan, essentially. It's a really kind of pretty story that's kind of separate from the rest of the Silmarillion. What's the name of the... I'm forgetting the actual name of the story there, but it's good. It's very good.
All right. So...
Ainulindale, I think is the name of it, but I could be wrong.
I was... Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I was going to be wondering that all the rest of the day.
Because Ainur is the name of the gods, so I think it's Song of the Gods, something like that.
All right, so the next section, the author talks about the difficulties he's going to have in this book, trying to figure out truth from fiction. I mean, and the problem of interpreting this book of fiction, or his fiction writings, not just one book. I mean, he had 3 volumes for The Lord of the Rings. He also had The Hobbit and all these other Silmarillion, which I've never read and never will.
You should.
And so, he acknowledges the difficulty that he's going to have in trying to interpret some of Tolkien's theology from these fictional writings. Obviously, he's telling a story inspired by his theology, sure, but I think he goes to some length here in the book about how he's going to have some difficulties, and he acknowledges difficulties in trying to figure out, whether his Tolkien's intent was to be, expressly theological or religious in telling these stories, or that maybe his theology would be irrelevant to the stories. Maybe he's just trying to make a beautiful story that's in a similar vein as his theology. So what are your thoughts about being able to interpret Tolkien's theology from his fiction writing? I mean, it's fiction for a reason. It's false.
I mean, it's
not true.
It's very hard to do, I think, and I think one of the best things about this Prolegomena, this introduction here, is his acknowledgement of that. If he was going through this saying, well, it's explicit, here's where I found it, and here's where it is, and I had no difficulty in finding it, that'd be the biggest, warning sign of this whole book. I'm very glad that he admits that this is a difficult task.
True. And he even talks about that Tolkien has specifically said that but he does say that the fiction corresponds to his Christian beliefs, so it's kind of like consistent with it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not like it is the Christian philosophy. It's a pre-Christian story, right? Isn't that the idea that this is like kind of a pre-historical
somewhat like
mythology or something?
He flipped back and forth on that and how exactly, because he sort of started it from the perspective of sort of England needs its own mythology, and you don't really have your own mythology. You have some of the Arthurian legends, but you don't have your own mythology like the Greeks have a mythology. And so that's sort of where he was coming at when he first started writing some of these stories. He kind of abandoned that slightly, and how really it leads into the real world. But really, when he was first writing, he was imagining this is a prehistoric age that will eventually lead into the real world. And that's really seen in some of his earliest writings of the Silmarillion. And really, the Silmarillion was first told by an English sailor who comes across, I think it was an elf, sitting on the very western shore of sort of England and stuff. And he talks to him, and then this elf, I think it was an elf, may have been just an old man, tells him the story of the Silmarillion. So it's very much tied into real history in that this was a real person who encountered this person. You have elements of that in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit too. And that, Tolkien's introduction, maybe to The Hobbit or to The Lord of the Rings, he says, I found these stories in the Red Book of Westmarch, and I'm relating them to you, the author. Tolkien specifically talking, to the reader there, which is interesting.
And Tolkien was not a trained theologian.
No, he was not.
So, but he was devout and obviously well read. What was his? He was a. What was he like you? a linguist.
He was a philologist, which is a study of the history of language, so to speak. So etymologies and things like that, and how language develops. He did a lot of translation work, and I think Austin Freeman mentions that. He translated part of the Bible. I have the Bible that he translated, the Jerusalem Bible, the first Bible in the English language to be translated directly from like the ancient Hebrew and the Greek rather than from the Vulgate, the Latin Bible. He also did, like we talked about earlier, a lot of the Old English and Middle English stuff. Translated some Norse stuff.
What the differences were in translations? I know you lose something if you go from Latin to the more dilute you are, or so many steps removed from the original language. Do you know? I don't know. Maybe you don't know how different it was translating it from like the original Hebrew or Greek. I guess Greek would have been some of the original writings, the letters and all that, to English as opposed to Greek to Latin to English. Do you know the answer to that?
I mean, a lot of things could happen. Like, you'd have to look at one specific thing and see, okay, well, this word was translated into this, roughly equivalent word in Latin, but this Latin word doesn't really exist in English. Let's translate it, somewhat equivalent. And, it's a million things could go wrong.
I guess I need to read a book on it.
Yeah. I mean,
somebody's got to have written some books on how
the Bible was translated,
the meaning has been altered by different translations. Anyway, getting back to the book. I like this quote on page 9 where he says, we can conclude then that while Tolkien claims no formal or professional theological training, he is a layman informed and opinionated enough to make theological judgments and implement them within his writings. And that's, I guess, the key to this book is that, I think it's the premise, isn't it? It seems like of this book that while he's not a theologian, he's not a priest, he's not a bishop, although we are bishops, but not trained bishops. We're
just by last name only.
Well, I don't know if that's true.
What do you mean?
You don't think we have a certain higher calling as bishops?
What do you mean? Higher calling to do what?
Well, we'll talk about that off podcast.
That's a little worrying.
Worrying? I don't know. Anyway. So where am I going with that? I just wanted to mention that's the premise of the book, right? I mean that he while he's not a trained theologian, his theology and his beliefs are woven in his writings, and so the question is, what precepts can we divine out of his writings and who he was and his letters and his fiction and all that stuff, and what kind of theological evaluation can we make on that? And then he talks about the difference between Tolkien's early writings and his later writings. You alluded to that earlier, that some of his writings and his versions of this fiction change over time. And of course, anybody who really thinks about religion or theology or philosophy is going to develop their firm beliefs over time. I expect you would, from your youth to when you're older. And so then the question is, how does this author, Dr. Austin Freeman, deal with that? And the way he does it is just to assume that his later writings are a more accurate portrayal of his firmly held beliefs, I guess. I mean, that's really the gist of what he's telling us. But he would expect that Tolkien's, his views and his writings would be altered over the course of his life. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's really what we're talking about, this next section that he's describing. And but his religious beliefs seem like they were constant over his lifetime, just like his versions of his writing, maybe how they applied in his writings changed over time. But he certainly was, and as the author says, he had a seeming permanent reverence for the Eucharist. And those kind of theological beliefs. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that's true. It's kind of what we were talking about earlier. I mean, he was raised by a priest. He was I looked it up while we were talking. He was Roman Catholic since he was a boy. Really, since he became really learned about the faith and everything like that. So he's been, living with the faith his whole life. And I think there's a quote. I'm sure it's in here somewhere, but I've skipped past it. But it's like, the Lord of the Rings is a Christian work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. Sort of the idea that it's, he didn't set out to write this as a Christian work, but of course his principles are going to be there. And as he's looking through it, he's like, well, I need to make sure this lines up with my theological principles and things like that, and that sort of stuff. Not that he's, really trying to write a Christian work, but that's the only work he can write as a Christian. It has to be Christian and things like that. And if he's looking at it from that perspective, he's looking at these earlier writings. Then if he has this Christian Lord of the Rings, this Christian worldview, then he has to change the earlier Silmarillion stuff, or else it can't be the same world. It's just incompatible. He mentions Ungoliant, the massive spider, was originally a personification of night. He says, if we're working at it in a Christian worldview, that can't happen. We can't really have that. So Ungoliant becomes one of the Maiar, one of the lesser angels, so to speak, that was corrupted by Melkor, Morgoth, things like that.
And I like the analogy that the author uses for the religious inspiration for Tolkien's writings is similar to the maps of Middle Earth. There are certain areas that are on a map, but the borderlands, I guess, would be left to interpretation. So that there's a certain map for the philosophy, but there's some overlap between different things and some creativity you can have within the map itself.
Yeah.
And then there's a quote here on top of page 13 that I thought was pretty good, where he says, at the same time, Tolkien would be the first to affirm that where he might depart from the boundaries of theological orthodoxy, he ought to be marked and warned rather than followed. So if he's wrong about the theology in his writings, he doesn't want you to follow that. He really has a firm belief in that there is a right or a wrong answer with regard to these questions, and he doesn't want anybody to be led astray from his stories and the misinterpretation of what he's got.
I think he would not be happy with the state of some Tolkien fans nowadays. I've seen people online who are like, "Oh, I'm an elf.
Oh yeah,
I'm an elf. I worship the Valar. I worship the Eru Ilúvatar, the highest god in Tolkien's world." And it's like, what would Tolkien do if he saw that? It'd just be be terrible.
Yeah, then that brings back to something I said at a previous podcast, which is we really shouldn't have gotten rid of all bullying. and elementary school and high school, maybe some college too. It's like, you're not an elf. If you're an elf, how can I punch you in the face and break your nose? Aren't you supposed to be like bigger and stronger and immortal? Semi-immortal, I guess.
They can be elves, so there's a whole...
I guess you can kill an elf.
You can kill an elf. You can, but there's actually elvish reincarnation in Tolkien's world. Is right? Elves get reincarnated. It's a whole thing. I'm sure he'll talk about this later. The Atherbeth Finrod Andreth, which I've mentioned on the podcast before. I doubt you remember it. But sort of, it's a conversation between an elf and a man about who is, the luckier. Essentially, that's kind of how it starts off. Who gets to die. We talked about that, but sort of, elves are immortal, but can be killed. They can die of sickness. They just don't die of old age. Essentially, they can die of grief, though. That happens a couple times throughout the stories.
I guess that'd be a pretty bad way to go.
Yeah, and then there's also
I don't want to drown.
Yeah, the drowning would be rough.
My thought in my youth was I wanted to die doing something that you can only do by dying. Like being swept up in the air by a tornado. Because you can drown without dying.
Sure.
You lose consciousness, or somebody could choke you out. They could strangle you, and then you just lose consciousness, come back. But I guess you could get sucked up in a tornado and
still live. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't really hold that view anymore.
It's a weird view to hold, I would say.
I was a little bit more adventurous back then. Now I'm thinking, you die in your sleep. That might be... If you're going to go, you just drift off.
Oh, that's uplifting.
Yes, there you go. All right, so the point of this book is in part to gain a picture of Tolkien's contribution to Christian thought generally, to understand his thoughts, and also to see how he's influenced Christian thought to the present, which I assume you think he has.
I would think so, yeah.
I don't think he has at all.
All right, well, that's great.
But I do, I wish he was a little bit more overtly religious. But I guess there's such a popularity to his writings. There's a resource there, but I guess it being so subtle, maybe those moral underpinnings about doing the right thing and try to resist temptation for power and control and wealth and riches and sacrifice for others is maybe is just...
I mean, I think Tolkien's biggest contribution is for sure just bringing people into the faith. Or he's the reason C.S. Lewis became Christian. So if you think C.S. Lewis has had any theological importance, then that's really because of Tolkien.
Religious.
Yeah. But he wasn't at first. He was an atheist, I believe, and Tolkien made him a Christian.
I make you a Christian.
Yes, but there's a joke that I've seen that because everybody's like, oh, which is better, Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter? And the answer to that question is, if you look at the really diehard fans of Lord of the Rings, they become hardcore Catholics or hardcore Christians. If you look at the really diehard fans of Harry Potter, they're blue-haired weirdos that claim that they're magic.
Interesting. Who what's her name? The author of the Harry Potter.
J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, she's of course under fire for having common sense. But she has a new podcast or interview programs out now, and she was equating her critics about transgenderism to be the Death Eaters, which actually, there's a lot of overlap in those kind of concepts. Yeah. But in her writings do. I mean, you may not like this, but her writings remind me. Those stories, the Harry Potter stories, remind me of some of the similar themes of Tolkien.
Well, but
I think she borrowed a lot.
You can't write a fantasy story post-Tolkien without it being very similar to Tolkien. Tolkien essentially shaped the entire fantasy genre. Yeah. There was nothing like him before him, and then there's everything like him after him, essentially. Yeah. But I mean, it's overall themes of. Really, it's like the Campbell had said about the hero of the thousand faces. A lot of it's overlap of just hero stories, where you have to you have some status. The hero has some status but loses it and is out in the wilderness for some period of time. Like Aragorn, you know, and you're out there in the wilderness, and then through a series of maybe turns of fate and decisions to do the right thing, you find yourself redeemed and all that. Well, before Tolkien, fantasy was either like children's stories, like actual fairy tales, or little children's stories, or I mean, you had some science fiction before him, sort of in that same vein.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Because Lord of the Rings was 1950s. Yes. So you had a little bit of sort of the science fiction that's sort of like a lot of science fiction. For sort of the adult audience, but Tolkien was the first to be like. I mean, I guess you had mythology as well. Mythology was the closest thing to Tolkien, like the actual Greek myths and things like that, pre-Tolkien.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, so then the author, page 13, specifically states what the scope of the book is, and he's talking about a specific niche or niche.
Yeah, niche. I say niche.
I say niche.
Do you say leisure or leisure?
Leisure.
I think I say leisure.
I'm sure you do. I probably say leisure because of the Leisure family in St. Louis, where there were two rival mobs in St. Louis that had a series of car bombings in the 80s.
Interesting.
One of them was Highway 55, if I remember correctly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, guys driving along the interstate. Bam! That was either a timer or a remote detonator. I can't remember which. But yeah, it was big to do. Yeah. And a buddy of mine's dad was a prosecutor in several of those.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were both attorneys. Anyway, so where was I at? The niche. Oh yeah, just to explain. It just says it flat out. This book is about Tolkien's theology. Period. And then he has a list, which I like these lists. I like how he organizes his thoughts. He has a list of what the book does not claim to do. And what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. There's like 5 of them. It does not seek to evaluate or weigh the objective truth of Tolkien's theological claims, apart from noting where it departs from the orthodox versions of them, which is interesting. It does not trace sources, though it does sometimes comment on Tolkien's relation to other theological figures, such as Cardinal Newman. And I can have his book, and I haven't been able to plow through it.
I have it too. I haven't started it yet.
Did I buy that for you? Or
No, I got it at the university bookstore, or book sale. 50 cents.
Right. Oh, yeah. I paid more than 50 cents for it. And Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, it does not claim, this book does not claim that the Lord of the Rings or any other works in the Legendarium is a Christian text, though it does claim that Tolkien's theology is apparent many times within the writings. It does not deny influences from other religious or cultural traditions. It does not enter extensively into discussions of secondary literature or scholarly debates, thank goodness, on Tolkien except when necessary. And so he's got a whole list of what he's not doing, and then very simply what he is doing is just talking about Tolkien's theology and how it's in his writings. So it's really just a book about Tolkien's theology, I guess, right? And then he talks about his methodology, and it's almost like a disclaimer. I guess that's what a Prolegomena
exactly
is that you're going to set forth. Okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're not going to do. I guess
essentially, I
should know more about that, being a former philosopher myself. And he's not putting all his works in the same level. Some of his letters, he seems to be saying they hold greater weight because they really talk more explicitly about his personal thoughts. So that he's going to give it a lot more weight to his nonfiction writings, which means not The Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit, I assume. There's no reference to The Hobbit specifically.
The Hobbit is very different in tone than the rest of his writings because it started out as a children's story. He wasn't really espousing, this is the deep worldview. The Hobbit was sort of an accidental entry into this big mythological world he'd already written because the Silmarillion he'd been writing his whole life since he was, I think, a teenager, early 20s at least, when he was fighting in the trenches of World War I. That's where he wrote down some of his first writings of the stories that became the Silmarillion. And The Hobbit was a story that used some of that he told to his children, and then they liked it so much that he wrote it all down and he sent it to a publisher. So it's kind of an accidental window into this world, but it's definitely not the same tone as Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion for sure.
Maybe that's why I like it so much better, because I'm more childlike.
Yeah, that's what I'd call you, childlike.
I was the audience.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Talking
about the methodology.
And he has another disclaimer that this book is meant to be descriptive and to present his views without comment or evaluation. He's not going to argue with Tolkien's theology. He mentions the author is a Protestant, and so he has stuff that he personally disagrees with Tolkien, but he's saying that he's not going to argue with them, which I would appreciate, because if you're going to write a book about Tolkien's theology, I don't know who this Austin Freeman guy is. They don't know who I am. And I think it's better for him to write this book. Here's Tolkien's theology. And nobody cares about Austin Freeman's philosophy, because you're reading the book to hear about Tolkien's theology and philosophy. And so I applaud his efforts, and hopefully he does a good job as we go through this, because nobody's reading this book to find out what Freeman has to say. Yeah, I would think. Probably except for his family and people who know him, probably.
Maybe one day he'll be very famous in the future. And,
he might be able to have a podcast such as ours, where he can espouse all his disagreements with Tolkien, and then people would care.
Maybe he can even come on our podcast at some point if he'd be so willing.
Well, if we were going to allow such a
do we have very high standards for who we let on this podcast?
We were banning anybody who's not Catholic. Don't they?
I was not aware of that rule.
Oh, all right.
I was not aware of that rule.
Yeah.
What would you think of the Prolegomena as a whole?
Well, I also wanted to mention at the very beginning, he mentions how this book has been a real long-term, work on his. It's been a part of his life for half a decade. Half a decade. That's 5 years, dude.
He's a younger guy.
He's a young guy, so I know 5 years is a long time, and it still is a long time. But 5 years, I was thinking it was going to be longer, but I guess he's in his 20s.
I think he's early 30s, maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure.
5 years seems like a long time. I was thinking, from a perspective of a 52-year-old, 10 years seems like a long time. But 5 years, but anyway. I like how it's written. And I like how he's saying there's a lot that it is not, and he seems to have a very good focus on a specific area that he is going to. Seems like he's a sharp cat, and seems pretty honest about it. And I'm looking forward to reading what his evaluation of Tolkien's theology is, and how it influences writing, don't you think?
Yeah.
That's my thoughts. What are your thoughts?
I'm really looking forward to this book. I'm really excited about this season. He said everything that I hoped he would say in this introduction, because it's, like I said earlier, it's hard to write about Tolkien without saying, well, this is what Tolkien said and any of the rest of you are wrong because this is the message that I want to convey through Tolkien. And I'm very glad that he said, no, this is difficult, right? This is a hard task, and this is explicitly Tolkien's writings. I'm not introducing my color commentary. That's something that he mentioned in the Babylon Bee interview. He's like, all of these academics out there who he says it's one thing to say that Tolkien was wrong, right? If you want to write a scholarly article on why Tolkien is wrong about, transgender issues or LGBT, whatever, do that. Just write an article about why Tolkien is wrong. You should not feel like you have to make sure Tolkien is true in everything to argue your point. You don't have to twist Tolkien to fit your message, right? Yes. If you have a message that you want to go for, do not twist somebody else who conflicts with it into making it agree with you.
Right. They're kind of trying to co-opt his creativity, his talent into their philosophy and their political beliefs. Yes. Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I agree that I'm glad that he's specifically saying he's going to try not to do that. And of course, there's going to be something in here that I would expect that he's going to, get close to the line or maybe cross the line. But at least all I want is honesty, and I want an attempt, to be independent. And if you're telling me you're trying to do that, it's like the 12 steps. The first thing is to admit you have a problem, And so I agree with that.
Yeah,
so,
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be.
This seems like a book that you would love to have read without the podcast.
Maybe.
Really?
I mean, I would have liked to. I'd like to read any book for the podcast. Really?
No, what I'm saying is, like, even if we didn't have the podcast, you would absolutely have said, "Hey, I want to buy this book."
Oh, absolutely. Right. Yes, I would have gotten this book regardless. Yeah. I think it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it.
I would have to confess that this is not a book that I would have picked up.
Probably not, but I'm looking forward to you doing more summarization. We'll see how it goes.
I struggle. I'm going to have to put together an outline.
Yeah, well, I write down all my notes.
I know. I'm not going to do what you've done, but I do need to have an outline.
I see. I think it would smoothly enough this time.
Well, how long is the podcast so far?
An hour and 1 minute.
Oh,
we've been
I
going
was
for
trying
a while.
to do it an hour. So
there you go.
We're
Perfect.
Now into a little bit over the line.
Perfect.
So actually, 50 minutes is probably my sweet spot.
Yeah.
So if I was a little more organized, I think we could have done a better job.
Do you have any more closing thoughts before we wind things down?
How many chapters are there?
There are 12, so we'll have 12.
A quick season. Then.
12 more episodes after this.
Are we going to have a contest? We did finally order the winners' shirts for the last two seasons.
Seasons 3 and that's on our Twitter.
T-shirts? Yeah. Okay, we should repost it.
Okay.
And congratulate our winner without identifying the winner because we don't want to, out our occult following.
Yes. You can. Thank you for pointing that out. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter for updates.
What is the Twitter address?
You haven't heard? It's capital U LMTD capital O opinions, Unlimited Opinions. I've been saying that hundreds of times now.
If you just do a search on Twitter for unlimited opinions, it comes up.
Oh, does it really?
Yeah.
I always search ULMTD capital O opinions, Unlimited Opinions. So that's where you could find us.
That's you're a perfectionist, like your mother.
That's where I always post updates on when the next episode's out and things like that, T-shirt giveaways and such. So make sure to follow us there.
Should we do something different than a T-shirt?
We could try.
We should do like a medallion or something.
What?
Like jewelry. You wear around your neck or something.
Yeah. Everybody's gonna want to join the competition.
We can have something made at that silver shop, silversmith down in St. John. So we can
custom silver unlimited opinions jewelry. That's what everybody wants.
This would be a beautiful work of art.
That'd be cool. I'm just saying,
like this tree. I assume that's a reference to some artwork in Tolkien's thing. On the cover of the book, it's kind of a beautiful tree with stars or whatever.
Yeah.
We could have a little medallion or something that would be.
We could do that
on a necklace. I think that would be brilliant.
That'd be
and then we
idea.
have the back of it would be
with
like
our logo. Yeah.
Unlimited Opinions, season 6,
5.
Season 5.
Yes.
You sure it's only 5?
Yes, I'm sure because we did Anthony Kenny's A New History of Western Philosophy,
yes.
Jake Jackson's Myths and Legends,
yes.
Joseph Campbell's and Bill Moyer's The Power of Myth,
yes.
and then A New History
History.
What is the? We just did this one. Political theory.
Yeah, political theory.
Yeah, I forget what the name of it is, but yeah. So 4 before this. This is 5.
All right, very good.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other closing thoughts?
No.
Well, this has been Season 5, Episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
make sure to tune in next week for God, I think, is the next chapter.
Oh, my God.
Exactly.